The paper that we presented last year is called Legislative Staff and Representation in Congress, and this paper is really inspired by an absence of research on staff. Right? So there's been a lot of literature in the last decade in political science that's really focused on trying to understand representation. Right? Are elected officials trying to act and make decisions that reflect the beliefs and attitudes and preferences of the people who elect them? Or are they responsive to interest groups or other types of organizations? But a lot of that is focused on the legislators and elected officials themselves, but often staff, policy directors, legislative directors, chiefs of staff are sort of the bridge, they're the glue that binds the public to the elected officials themselves, right? So if I contact my congressperson, likely I'm going to speak to a staff person, and then that staff person is going to translate my opinion to them. And so what role do these staff play in the democratic process, and can a focus on staff really help us make sense of some of the surprises that we found in the last decade in sort of the absence of a clear link sometimes between public preferences and staff? Public preferences in the way elected officials behave, actually. So what we did is we launched one of the first surveys of elites, and we surveyed congressional staffers. So we surveyed all policy chiefs of staff, all legislative directors, all chiefs of staff, for all congresspeople and all senators at the federal level. And we partnered with sort of a few elected officials on the Hill to try and increase our response rate. And we got about a 10% response rate, which is really good for work of this sort that focuses on elites. And more importantly, the type of people who responded to our survey turned out to be very similar to sort of the general type of folks on the Hill. So we have a good balance on partisanship. When we look at sort of how conservative or liberal our respondents are, they're pretty well balanced with the distribution of liberalism and conservatism in the different parties. And they're also balanced by region, gender, sort of all of the sorts of things that you would want to see. And so in that survey, we asked a bunch of questions about what staff focus on, what staff think about the public, what the staff think the public thinks. And all of those really set the stage for an analysis of thinking about how staffers play a really big role in democratic representation here.
So one really important thing that staff do is that they make recommendations to their member or to the senator about how to vote on a bill. And that's that key bridge that Matta was talking about between the public and the actual decisions that get made in Congress. And the question is, what do these people actually know about the public, what the public wants before they make that recommendation? And so we asked them, when you're going to make a recommendation to your member or to your senator, what are you going to base that on? And they told us that the most important thing was public opinion, that this was really important. Okay, we take that at face value, and then so we asked them, well, what exactly does the public want on a range of policy domains that are actively debated in the public, they're actively debated in Congress? Things like background checks for guns, things like the Affordable Care Act, which was a really hot button issue around this time because we fielded this in the fall of 2016. Things like climate change regulation. And so we asked them, what do people in your district want on these issues? And we should expect that they should know the answer to that, because it turns out that congressional offices spend an enormous amount of time, energy, and resources collecting every single contact that they get and entering it into a database, exactly for the reason of understanding what does their district want. There's also public opinion polls that are out there. There's lots of ways that they could know what the public wants. They have town halls, they have one-on-one meetings, they do lots of things. But the reality is that when we asked them, what do you think the public wants in your district, they did not know on all issues, and it was across the board. Even if you think about, well, what are the likely voters? Do they know what the likely voters want? No. Do they know what the co-partisans want? No. Do they know what the U.S. public at large wants? No. So this is a really surprising finding in the idea that the representation literature that Matta was talking about really made this assumption that the public preference was somehow being translated into policy. And in order for that to happen, there has to be, I assume, some knowledge of what the public preference is, and we found a complete lack of knowledge. So we had 4 hypotheses for why this was. One is it perhaps how much experience the staffer has. So a more experienced staffer might know better what the public wants. We found no evidence for that. The second one was how competitive the race was. So maybe if you're in a really safe seat, you don't need to care about what the public wants. We did not find evidence for that either. The third idea was what's called egocentric bias, which is this idea that the staffer might be substituting their own beliefs for the public's beliefs. So we asked them, what do they want at background checks, on climate change, on the Affordable Care Act, and pretty systematically, this was true. They were answering that the people in their district wanted what they wanted. So they were substituting their own beliefs for the public's beliefs. In addition, we tried to think about the relationship between interest groups and what they're thinking about the public. And we found a really key distortion there, which is that the more that these offices report meeting with certain interest groups, the closer they believe the public is to that interest group's position. So in other words, the interest groups are driving a wedge between what staffers and Congress think the public wants and what the public actually wants.
So in addition to the observational analyses where we tried to link the misperceptions that staffers had of their constituents to these various hypotheses, including interest group access, we also fielded 2 survey experiments on the survey instrument that we distributed to staffers in order to pin down sort of the causal effect of interactions with interest groups on how staffers perceived what their constituents wanted. So the first survey experiment that we put on this instrument was a list experiment that tried to elicit from staffers the proportion of staffers who admitted that they changed their mind about a policy after meeting with a donor to their member of Congress's campaign. And we found that about 45% of these top staffers reported that they had indeed changed their mind about a piece of legislation after meeting with a donor to their member of Congress's election or re-election campaign. And these list experiments are valuable because they allow us to see what population admits about a sensitive behavior in a context where they don't have to individually admit that they have performed that action. So a second survey experiment that we embedded on this survey instrument was a little vignette that asked staffers to imagine that they had received correspondence from very different sources, either from employees of a large employer in their district, from members of a citizens group in their district, or from ordinary citizens themselves. And then we asked staffers a variety of questions about what they thought about that correspondence. So for instance, how representative might this correspondence be of your district's opinion as a whole? How likely are you to talk to your member of Congress about this correspondence that you've received? And how likely is it to shape the sort of recommendations that you make to your member of Congress? And notably, we found that correspondence that came from employees of a large business in their district, staffers rated these types of messages as being more representative of their constituents as a whole than correspondence from individual constituents themselves or a citizens group. And we interpret these results as potentially indicating one way that organized interests, in this case businesses in the districts of members of Congress, can sort of skew the perception that members of Congress and their staffs have about what their constituents want. If a business sends a whole slew of letters or correspondence or meeting requests to a member of Congress and his or her staff, that can change the way that that office thinks about what the public wants in their district. So putting it all together, we think that our paper contributes to debates over representation and inequality in Congress at a time of rising inequality. So we think that our results can help answer why scholars like Martin Gillens and Benjamin Page and Larry Bartels have found this striking disconnect between what Congress does and what average people want. One reason why that we may see that disconnect is that organized interest groups are skewing the way that staffers perceive their constituents' preferences.